So we've talked about extroversion and introversion, and we also talked about sensing and intuition. And now we're going to focus on thinking or feeling, which is essentially a component of the personality that makes judgments. It's making a decision. So how do you come to a decision? And so we're going to be looking at thinking and feeling based solely on the process that we use to draw those conclusions. And the people who prefer thinking tend to orient towards logic, whereas the people who prefer feeling orient toward emotion and also relationships. So the people who prefer thinking are not thinking about how their decision impacts other people as much. They're thinking about what's the most logical and fair conclusion. And the people who prefer feeling are basing their decisions solely on what's best for everybody involved. How does this impact other people? How does it impact me? Like, how are my feelings impacting this decision? So that's where we're orienting towards here. And one of the ways to think about this in terms of the feeling versus the thinking is the hurt feelings element. So the thinking type, as you're discussing, like, well, where are we going to go for dinner tonight? And McDonald's comes up, or any fast food. The thinking type might go right for logic and say, ugh, it's so bad for you. There's so much fat and carbs and calories. And the feeling type might hear that and just think to themselves, like, wait a minute, are you saying I'm fat? Like, they might take it very personally, whereas the feeling or the thinking types, no, I'm not saying anything about you. I'm talking about in general, that's just not healthy food. So the feeling type will often take things very, very personally and be thinking about how statements of logic and fact are actually, maybe even finely veiled or hidden, but that it's still about them and that they take it personally. And another way to think about thinking and feeling is that the thinking type is really going to break down processes and think about it in terms of like pros and cons and the logic behind it and what is the outcome. And the feeling type is saying, you know what, this is important to me, or it's important to somebody else. If the decision is about what's going to impact somebody else, and they're saying it's important to them, that those feelings rooted in the relationship and also in what feels valuable to that person is going to supersede the pros and cons. It's going to supersede the logic. All right, so the components of thinking and feeling that are going to show up in those Facet worksheets are first the logical and the empathic. And so this is the core facet of thinking and feeling. And it's, remember, what we're trying to do here is make a decision about something, to create a judgment about something, or to come to a conclusion. And so this dichotomy, the logic and the empathic, is all about the criteria that we use to reach the judgment. So the logical type values fairness, they value reason, and they see those things as far more dependable than emotion. And the empathic type sees relationship as the source of meaning, and that truth comes out of feeling. So logic is looking for truth in fairness and reason and logic, and empathic is looking for truth based in feeling. Empathic is making decisions with their heart, logic is making decisions with their head. The reasonable and the compassionate is the standard that we use to maintain relationships while we make these judgments in the thinking and feeling facets. So the reasonable is utilizing that logic in their decision-making process, and what they are arguing in that process is, this just makes sense. Like, look, sequential reasoning, if this, then this. And so that reasonable thinking is essentially their argument for making for coming to the judgment that they come to. And when challenged by somebody who maybe is more compassionate, like, well, what about how that impacts so and so? They're like, okay, well, I'm basing this on reason, not on emotion. The compassionate type is making the decision based on emotion. They're making a decision based on the personal needs of other people. And so they value mercy more than they value fairness. The reasonable type loves fairness. If this is true for them, it's also true for them. Like a manager at work who's reasonable, is going to create schedules that are fair for everybody. If so-and-so gets a day off, so does everybody else. The compassionate person who values mercy over fairness is like, well, this person has a special need that needs to be met. They have, there's a sick family member or whatever, and they're making decisions that are more compassionate and less reasonable. The challenging and the accommodating, questioning and accommodating is it's essentially how people deal with the differences as they attempt to arrive at the judgment. So if you're in a relationship with somebody and you're trying to create a conclusion or make a decision together, and one person is more reasonable and the other person is more compassionate, then this is how they deal with that difference. So it's the part of the judgment forming process that's involved when the judgment has to be shared with somebody else, right? If both people have to make a decision together. So the challenging type is going to ask questions that, or I'm sorry, I keep saying challenging. I mean questioning. So the questioning type is all about asking those questions, is about trying to expose flaws in the reasoning, not because they're a jerk, but because they want to come up with the best possible judgment or conclusion or decision. And so by asking those questionings, or asking those questions, they're making a better decision. The accommodating person is more likely to just be like, whatever you want, it clearly is more important to you. So this is where it becomes kind of a challenge. The accommodating person is making decisions that are rooted in feelings, but if they're worried about hurting the other person's feelings, then that almost becomes more important, because the feeling type is highly accommodating. They want to maintain harmony and they don't want to be in conflict. So what they don't realize, the thinking person doesn't realize, that asking all those questions and challenging the solutions that they have come up with may feel hurtful to the other person. Go back to the proposal. Let's just go get some fast food. The person who's saying, oh, God, it's so bad for you, and the fat and the calories and they are essentially challenging the solution and exposing the flaws. And what the feeling person is experiencing in that, sort of stereotypical cartoon image is that their feelings are hurt based on those questions. So the accommodating type is really trying to make everybody feel okay, and the questioning type is just trying to get to the root of the problem. All right, the critical and the accepting. This is what we do after we've made our initial judgment. So after you've made that judgment, like the critical type is going to poke more holes in it to try to get a better outcome. So they, like, let's say that there's two people, it's a partnership, a romantic partnership. They're coming to some sort of conclusion about how to manage the household, and they've asked all the questions, and there's been accommodation, and all of these things are happening. What the critical type will do is kind of say, okay, but well, what about this? And they will add more criticism to try to improve the outcome. Whereas the accepting person is just going to be like, no, I think this is great, because if we can just accept it as it is, then we're not hurting anybody's feelings. And if we're thinking about it in terms of, people who are friends and who live together and who impact each other, criticism toward the other person is not about, if you're coming at it from like the thinking side, it's not about hurting the other person's feelings. It's about trying to get it to be better, to have your life together be better. And the accepting type just accepts, as they are, and understands that, like, if I can communicate with tolerance and kindness, maybe that will yield better results. The critical type isn't thinking about the other person's feelings. They're thinking about improving the results or improving the outcome. All right, and then the last is the tough and the tender. So this is essentially the impact of the judgment and how you carry out the decision once the judgment has been made. So what happens on the thinking side, if you are aligned with the logical, reasonable, questioning, critical sides, then you have made your decision, right? The judgment has been passed, the conclusion has been drawn, and you are standing firm in that decision. To be tough means, nope, I've made up my mind. I have used logic and reason. I've asked questions and I have poked holes, and I have made my decision, and I am not going to change. For the person who's tough, to change their mind after they've made a decision, it's really, really hard for them to do. Now, on the other side, the tender component is still very much like rooting, they're more fluid, right? Because they might change their mind at the last minute because suddenly they realize, oh, having made this decision actually has a really negative impact on this other person. Or I've made the decision, but I still don't feel good about it because it brings up fear, brings up uncertainty, or like my emotions are getting the best of me here. And so they tend to be more fluid in that decision making process and are truly valuing the perceptions of other people and of their own hearts in coming to that final decision. All right, so that's it for the thinking and feeling components. And again, read those descriptions of the facets, highlight what you think is applicable to you and in your relationship, utilize that for your analysis in the paper, and contact me with any questions.